He showed it me. Pinch anything? No. What did you do it for then? The gang had gathered round. It was as though an impromptu court were about to form and try some case of deviation. T said, "It's a beautiful house," and still watching the ground, meeting no one's eyes, he licked his lips, first one way, then the other. "What do you mean, a beautiful house?" Blackie asked with scorn. "It's got a staircase 200 years old, like a corkscrew. Nothing holds it up." "What do you mean, nothing holds it up? Does it float?" "It's to do with opposite forces," old Misery said. "What else?" "There's paneling, like in the Blue Boar, 200 years old." "Is old Misery 200 years old?" Mike laughed suddenly and then was quiet again. The meeting was in a serious mood. For the first time since T had strolled into the car park on the first day of the holidays, his position was in danger. It only needed a single use of his real name, and the gang would be at his heels. "What did you do it for?" Blackie asked. He had no jealousy. He was anxious to retain T in the gang if he could. It was the word beautiful that worried him, that belonged to a class world that you could still see parodied at the Wormsley Common Empire by a man wearing a top hat and a monocle with a ha-ha accent. He was tempted to say, "My dear Trevor, old chap," and unleash his hellhounds. "If you'd broken in," he said sadly, "that indeed would have been an exploit worthy of the gang." "This was better," T said. "I found out things." He continued to stare at his feet, not meeting anybody's eye, as though he were absorbed in some dream he was unwilling or ashamed to share. "What things?" "Old Misery's going to be away all tomorrow and bank holiday." Blackie said with relief. "You mean we could break in and pinch things?" Somebody asked. Blackie said, "Nobody's going to pinch things. Breaking in, that's good enough, isn't it? We don't want any court stuff." "I don't want to pinch anything," T said. "I've got a better idea." "What is it?" T raised eyes as gray and disturbed as the drab August day. "We'll put it down," he said. "We'll destroy it." Blackie gave a single hoot of laughter and then, like Mike, fell quiet, daunted by the serious, implacable gaze. What's the police be doing all the time?" he said. "They'd never know. We do it from inside. I've found a way in," he said with a sort of intensity. "We'd be like worms, don't you see, in an apple. When we came out again, there'd be nothing there. No staircase, no panels, nothing but just walls. And then we'd make the walls fall down somehow." "We'd go to Jug," Blackie said. "Who's to prove? And anyway, we wouldn't have pinched anything," he added without the smallest flicker of glee. "There wouldn't be anything to pinch after we'd finished." "I've never heard of going to prison for breaking things," Summers said. "There wouldn't be time," Blackie said. I've seen housebreakers at work." "There are 12 of us," T said. "We'd organize. None of us know how." "I know," T said. He looked across at Blackie. "Have you got a better plan?" "Today," Mike said tactlessly, "we're pinching free rides." "Free rides," T said. "Kid stuff. You can stand down, Blackie, if you'd rather." "The gang's got to vote. Put it up then." Blackie said uneasily, "It's proposed that tomorrow and Monday we destroy old Misery's house." "Hear, hear," said a fat boy called Joe. "Who's in favor?" T said, "It's carried." "How do we start?" Summers asked. "He'll tell you," Blackie said. It was the end of his leadership. He went away to the back of the car park and began to kick a stone, dribbling it this way and that. There was only one old Morris in the park, for few cars were left there except lorries. Without an attendant, there was no safety. He took a flying kick at the car and scraped a little paint off the rear mudguard. Beyond paying no more attention to him than to a stranger, the gang had gathered round T. Blackie was dimly aware of the fickleness of favor. He thought of going home, of never returning, of letting them all discover the hollowness of TA leadership. But suppose, after all, what T proposed was possible. Nothing like it had ever been done before. The fame of the Wormsley Common car park gang would surely reach around London. There would be headlines in the papers. Even the grown-up gangs who ran the betting at the All-In Wrestling and the Barrow Boys would hear with respect of how old Misery's house had been destroyed, driven by the pure, simple, and altruistic ambition of fame for the gang. Blackie came back to where T stood in the shadow of old Misery's wall. T was giving his orders with decision. It was as though this plan had been with him all his life. Pondered through the seasons, now in his 15th year, crystallized with the pain of puberty. You, he said to Mike, bring some big nails, the biggest you can find, and a hammer. Anybody who can, better bring a hammer and a screwdriver. We'll need plenty of them. Chisels, too. We can't have too many chisels. Can anybody bring a saw? I can, Mike said. Not a child's saw, T said, a real saw. Blackie realized he had raised his hand like any ordinary member of the gang. Right, you bring one, Blackie. But now there's a difficulty. We want a hacksaw. What's a hacksaw? Someone asked. You can get 'em at Woolworth's, Summers said. The fat boy called Joe said gloomily, I knew it would end in a collection. I'll get one myself, T said. I don't want your money, but I can't buy a sledgehammer. Blackie said, they are working on number 15. I know where they'll leave their stuff for bank holiday. Then that's all, T said. We meet here at 9 sharp. I've got to go to church, Mike said. Come over the wall and whistle. We'll let you in. On Sunday morning, all were punctual except Blackie, even Mike. Mike had a stroke of luck. His mother felt ill. His father was tired after Saturday night, and he was told to go to church alone with many warnings of what would happen if he strayed. Blackie had difficulty in smuggling out the saw and then in finding the sledgehammer at the back of number 15. He approached the house from a lane at the rear of the garden for fear of the policeman's beat along the main road. The tired evergreens kept off a stormy sun. Another wet bank holiday was being prepared over the Atlantic, beginning in swirls of dust under the trees. Blackie climbed the wall into Misery's garden. There was no sign of anybody anywhere. The lay stood like a tomb in a neglected graveyard. The curtains were drawn. The house slept. Blackie lumbered nearer with the saw and the sledgehammer. Perhaps, after all, nobody had turned up. The plan had been a wild invention. They had woken wiser. But when he came close to the back door, he could hear a confusion of sound hardly louder than a hive and swarm. A clickety-clack, a bang-bang, a scraping, a creaking, a sudden painful crack. He thought, it's true, and whistled. They opened the back door to him, and he came in. He had at once the impression of organization, very different from the old happy-go-lucky ways under his leadership. For a while, he wandered up and down stairs looking for tea. Nobody addressed him. He had a sense of great urgency, and already he could begin to see the plan. The interior of the house was being carefully demolished without touching the walls. Summers, with hammer and chisel, was ripping out the skirting boards in the ground floor dining room. He had already smashed the panels of the door. In the same room, Joe was heaving up the parquet blocks, exposing the soft wood floorboards over the cellar. Coils of wire came out of the damaged skirting, and Mike sat happily on the floor, clipping the wires. On the curved stairs, 2 of the gang were working hard with an inadequate child's saw on the banisters. When they saw Blackie's big saw, they signaled for it wordlessly. When he next saw them, a quarter of the banisters had been dropped into the hall. He found T at last in the bathroom. He sat moodily in the least cared-for room in the house, listening to the sounds coming up from below. You've really done it, Blackie said with awe. What's going to happen? We've only just begun, T said. He looked at the sledgehammer and gave his instructions. You stay here and break the bath and the wash basin. Don't bother about the pipes. They come later. Mike appeared at the door. "I've finished the wires, T," he said. "Good. You've just got to go wandering round now. The kitchen's in the basement. Smash all the china and glass and bottles you can lay hold of. Don't turn on the taps. We don't want a flood yet. Then go into all the rooms and burn out the drawers. If they are locked, get one of the others to break them open. Tear up any papers you find and smash all the ornaments. Better take a carving knife with you from the kitchen. The bedroom's opposite here. Open the pillows and tear up the sheets. That's enough for the moment. And you, Blackie, when you've finished in here, crack the plaster in the passage up with your sledgehammer." "What are you going to do?" Blackie asked. "I'm looking for something special," T said. It was nearly lunchtime before Blackie had finished and went in search of T. Chaos had advanced. The kitchen was a shambles of broken glass and china. The dining room was stripped of parquet. The skirting was up. The door had been taken off its hinges, and the destroyers had moved up a floor. Streaks of light came in through the closed shutters, where they worked with the seriousness of creators, and destruction, after all, is a form of creation. A kind of imagination had seen this house as it had now become. Mike said, "I've got to go home for dinner." "Who else?" T asked, but all the others, on one excuse or another, had brought provisions with them. They squatted in the ruins of the room and swapped unwanted sandwiches. Half an hour for lunch, and they were at work again. By the time Mike returned, they were on the top floor, and by 6 the superficial damage was completed. The doors were all off, all the skirtings raised, the furniture pillaged and ripped and smashed. No one could have slept in the house except on a bed of broken plaster. T gave his orders, 8 o'clock next morning, and to escape notice they climbed singly over the garden wall into the car park. Only Blackie and T were left. The light had nearly gone, and when they touched a switch, nothing worked. Mike had done his job thoroughly. "Did you find anything special?" Blackie asked. T nodded. "Come over here," he said, "and look." Out of both pockets he drew bundles of pound notes. "Old Misery's savings," he said. Mike ripped out the mattress, but he missed them. "What are you going to do? Share them?" "We aren't thieves," T said. "Nobody's going to steal anything from this house. I kept these for you and me, a celebration." He knelt down on the floor and counted them out. There were 70 in all. "We'll burn them," he said, "one by one." And taking it in turns, they held a note upward and lit the top corner, so that the flame burnt slowly toward their fingers. The gray ash floated above them and fell on their heads like age. "I'd like to see Old Misery's face when we are through," T said. "You hate him a lot?" Blackie asked. "Of course I don't hate him," T said. "There'd be no fun if I hated him." The last burning note illuminated his brooding face. "All this hate and love," he said, "it's soft, it's hooey. There's only things, Blackie." And he looked round the room crowded with the unfamiliar shadows of half-things, broken things, former things. "I'll race you home, Blackie," he said. Next morning, the serious destruction started. 2 were missing, Mike and another boy whose parents were off to South Bend and Brighton in spite of the slow, warm drops that had begun to fall, and the rumble of thunder in the estuary like the first guns of the old Blitz. "We've got to hurry," T said. Summers was restive. "Haven't we done enough?" he asked. "I've been given a bob for slot machines. This is like work. We've hardly started," T said. "Why, there's all the floors left, and the stairs. We haven't taken out a single window. You voted like the others. We are going to destroy this house. There won't be anything left when we've finished." They began again on the first floor, picking up the top floorboards next the outer wall, leaving the joists exposed. Then they sawed through the joists